they announced last week about UCLA letting go of DeShaun Foster. And, I know some people might think I'm behind the eight ball on this, but I always like to let things settle a little bit because I think a lot of the time in sports media in particular, or podcasts, et cetera, people always like to go with the reaction take or just the gut instinct or what have you. But I've always been the type of person I like to sit down and evaluate and just kind of contemplate a little bit, which makes me come back to this UCLA hiring. And, you know, I did my preview of them back in December when they finished 5-7. And, to go from I go back and I think of that initial press conference with DeShaun Foster. And I remember just feeling so freaking bad for this guy in the sense that, okay, Chip Kelly leaves for Ohio State in February. Athletic director Martin Jarmond looks around and says, shit, we don't have anybody. What do we do? Okay, what do we do? Okay, DeShaun Foster has been our running backs coach for the past 6 years. The players seem to like him. We'll just elevate him and see what happens. It's pretty similar to when the Texans elevated Lovie Smith as their head coach. It's almost a situation like that where they essentially let him be a scapegoat. So to go from that whole press conference situation where it was pretty evident that he had no media training whatsoever, they just kind of threw him to the wolves. And for him to be able to salvage a 5-win team out of that roster who was totally depleted in terms of the offensive line. However, Ethan Garber deserves a lot of credit too. And now fast forward to 2025, starting off 0-3, getting spanked by Utah, and then New Mexico the week after, or I guess it was 2 weeks later. But in any event, I mean, you just got to feel bad. You just got to feel for DeShaun Foster, someone who has so much history with UCLA, one of the best running backs ever to be at that program, and for them to just kind of just toss him aside like that, it definitely is a shame. And you just sit there and hope that they probably at least had expectations to go to a bowl game this year. And there's just so much history in terms of the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and the program was founded back in like 1919. So you just sit there and say to yourself, man, they really haven't had a lot of sustained success since, the late 90s. And, I love to see this program really just kind of come into its own. So with that said, I kind of asked myself, who would be kind of the top 3 candidates for this UCLA job? Because I know for me, I listened to a little bit of the press conference with Martin Jarmond, and, I know at least I had some of the takeaways with what he said. And, ironically, one of the things that he said was the next playoffs and, quote, possess the attitude and the skills to see it through. So, I mean, I guess the good news is at least they see an element of it being like, hey, this is not going to be an easy project. And most importantly, I think the big elephant in the room is what exactly kind of resources are you going to have at UCLA? I mean, it's pretty obvious to everybody that they're pretty much more or less a basketball school. They've been in financial deficit for a number of seasons. Pasadena Rose Bowl, their stadium is 27 miles away from campus. So, I mean, and not to mention too, that you're literally the third most popular team in your entire city. So when you look at all those things kind of put together, it's an uphill battle, right? And I think a lot of people understand that. A lot of people see that. However, I think UCLA can be a really attractive job. I'm not going to sit there and say it's more popular, more attractive than Virginia Tech, but I would probably argue I'd rather have the UCLA job than Oklahoma State, for example. So with that said, I mean, there are a couple candidates that kind of really come to mind, and a bunch of different names have been thrown out there, but I'm only going to talk about 3 that I think are probably the top candidates for the job in my opinion. But let's start with Tony White. He's the defensive coordinator at Florida State. Before that, he was with Nebraska, and there's a number of reasons why in my opinion this could definitely be a really good fit. I'd say first and foremost, he is super familiar with UCLA. He has been able to attract recruits, definitely particularly within the West Coast and a number of his different stops. He's developed a lot of top 25 defenses at several programs. I mean, you can see what he's doing at Florida State right now. You can see what he's doing at Nebraska. And also he's been nominated twice for the Bryles Award, which for those of you who don't know, which is essentially the award for the top best assistant coach in the entire country. So when you have that type of history and when I watch this UCLA team, aside from them just having no offensive line whatsoever, one of the things I kind of say to myself is I think UCLA is kind of missing that identity of really being able to be physical and to be consistent. I mean, granted, UCLA, I think defensively surprised a lot of people last year, but I'm talking more in terms of an overall identity, in terms of an overall program vision, etc. So it's one of those things too. I mean, he's been a defensive. I mean, I talked about a defensive coordinator at. So I mean, he has experience coaching on the West Coast. He has connections to UCLA, and not to mention too, he played at UCLA. So it just makes, I think in many ways, it makes a lot of sense considering the connection that he has there. But I think the one kind of setback that you have if you're UCLA to some degree is he's never been a head coach before. And if you look at some of the head coaching hires that they've had in the past, I mean, you look at Chip Kelly, you look at Jim Moore, you look at Ryan Newhazel. I mean, Newhazel, I'm butchering his last name, so correct me in the comments, but you get what I mean. I mean, UCLA, historically speaking, has always kind of leaned a little bit more towards head coaches who have head coaching experience. And in my opinion, I see that being another pattern going into this coaching cycle. But if I'm UCLA, I think you seriously have to consider interviewing for Tony White, especially considering his history with the program, his presence on the West Coast, a bunch of defensive coordinator stops that he's done before. And most importantly, I think just a guy who also interviewed back in 2024 for the job as well. So I think that's also worth mentioning. I'd say another name that I'm gonna mention, this could be my Florida bias coming out, but I think Dan Mullen is someone you have to consider. I mean, I think if you're UCLA, I think one of the things you kind of ask yourself is, if hypothetically you were in a scenario where you can go for a quote unquote splashy hire, is Dan Mullen that type of guy that could get people excited? But again, there's a couple of things that you have to kind of think to yourself. One, is UCLA necessarily a better situation than UNLV? I mean, UNLV is one of the top programs in the group of five. They have a good amount of resources. You can tell that they've been investing significantly. But at the same time, before Dan Mullen and before Barry Odom, they really didn't have a ton of success at UNLV. So in many ways, I see a lot of similarities between the UCLA job and UNLV if you're looking at it that way. Now, granted, I don't think Dan Mullen is really a huge recruiter for that matter. And quite frankly, a lot of his success hasn't been on the West Coast. A lot of his success was at Mississippi State, at Florida, both teams in the East Coast. So I think that could be a little bit of a struggle in terms of them finding that balance as well. But at the same time, too, you also say to yourself, hey, Dan Mullen has had 13 years of head coaching experience in the SEC. He has a career record of 106 and 61. He's off to a phenomenal start at UNLV, starting off 3-0. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be excited about Dan Mullen. I mean, I've criticized him a bunch on this show. I've talked about some of his coordinator hires, for example. However, when you're looking at a job like UCLA, I think if you want kind of a bold, splashy hire, someone who can really kind of turn some heads, Dan Mullen is a guy that comes to mind. And, again, there's going to be some hesitation to that. I mean, you don't know how NIL is going to look. You don't know how their facility is going to look. And also just what the general infrastructure is going to be. I think if you're Dan Mullen and you say to yourself, hey, I legitimately need 3 to 5 seasons to really put this together, and they do decide to hire another athletic director, I think that's something that you have to be at least a little bit excited about, in the sense that, hey, you kind of have a quote unquote fresh, clean slate. However, if you kind of look at UCLA as in terms of academically, or in terms of, them athletically, for example, there's been a lot of struggles, let's say, internally. And I think that's one of those questions that you really kind of have to have answered in order if you really want to take this job. Because I think if you're UCLA, the one thing I'd say to ourselves is, hey, we hired a guy in Chip Kelly who clearly didn't want to be the guy to go around and go to donors and try to get money. He just wants to coach ball. He doesn't want anything to do with recruiting. He isn't the type of guy that wants to build anything. He wants to show up, implement a system, and win games, and then go and find the next best job. That's what Chip Kelly is. And whether you like it or not, it just didn't really seem like a good fit. And then as soon as Chip Kelly saw that this isn't going to get any better, he did for Ohio State as soon as he had the chance. So again, that's just another situation that you're going to kind of struggle with. But I'd say lastly, if you're a UCLA fan, to me, I think the most obvious target and to me the best fit for this job is going to be Northwestern's former head coach Pat Fitzgerald. I think to me that makes the most sense out of all the head coaching options that I've seen. And I think there are a number of reasons why you think this. I'd say first and foremost, before I get into this too, he's been cleared of any allegations of the bullying scandal that happened with Northwestern before the 2023 season. If you go back and read any of those legal documents or any of those reports, nobody ever necessarily accuses Fitzgerald of, abusing anybody or bullying anybody, or even that he had knowledge of it. I think there is a good amount of evidence to suggest that he knew nothing about it and he was kind of just the scapegoat of it. So I think when you sit there and say to yourself, okay, he was clear of that. He coached 17 seasons at Northwestern, who I think in some ways are in a similar spot to UCLA in the sense that it's a very academically strong program. You're familiar with the Big Ten, and you've proven that you can, most importantly, win at a place with fewer resources. I think if you're UCLA, you tick every single box that you would want. You have a former head coach. You have a guy who can navigate the Big Ten. You have a guy who can win over donors, win over boosters, and most importantly, he can turn grapes into wine. And I think if you're UCLA, to me, it just seems like a really good fit. And I think if you're a guy like Pat Fitzgerald, you're not going to go in and just take any old head coaching job. You're gonna sit there and really scout out what you think the best job is going to be. And to me, if you're Pat Fitzgerald, I think UCLA makes all the sense in the world. If you look at his overall record of 110 wins to 101 losses, sure, if you're looking at that, that's a mediocre record. However, there's a lot of context to that. You have 65 Big Ten wins. You won the division title twice in his tenure. And, yes, there were only 14 wins over his last 4 seasons. However, when you're kind of looking at this full picture, there's a lot to be excited about if you're UCLA. And I think Pat Fitzgerald, for me, is definitely the best fit in terms of UCLA, in terms of their future. But I definitely think that this job is way more attractive than people want to admit. I think there's certainly going to be some challenges to it. I kind of elaborated on that, but I'd love to see in the comments what you guys think. But